Thomas. Oh, thank you. Okay, I guess I'll continue. That's the right answer. This meeting being recorded. Okay, here we go. Good. Okay, so as you can see at line 2, this is taken from the Talmud, from the volume of the Talmud called Yoma, page 38a. I think in English translation of Talmudic volumes, they're normally called tractates. I've never never heard of tractate being used in any other context other than the Talmud. But if it is, I'd be really fascinated to hear it. So when discussing with non-Jews, I have to remember also not to say tractate. So here's the story which the Talmud teaches. There was someone called Nicanor. Now, if I was to say to you Nicanor today, and you are a regular visitor to Jerusalem, what might you think of with Nicanor? A little bit specialist knowledge, but what might you think of with Nicanor? You might think if you went to the Canyon, to the big shopping mall in Gilo in Jerusalem, next to the Teddy Stadium, where any rugby fans on this call, I once saw David Campese play rugby sevens for Australia at the Teddy Stadium in Jerusalem. It's unbelievable that such a rugby legend would be playing a stadium that has 3 sides to it. Incredible. And no fourth side. Anyway, so Nicanor is the name of a gate in the shopping center. But of course, the shopping center is not the origin of the name. The name is based on a person. And we'll end up at this Nicanor. So line 3, we'll start there. Nicanor na'asu nisim le'taltotav. What the Talmud is telling us is the headline of the story is there was someone called Nicanor, and miracles were done to his doors. Now, we have to find out who Nicanor was. We have to find out what miracles were done. We also have to find out what doors we're referring to here and why miracles were performed for them. So the Talmud begins to elaborate here. And this is a piece I said about Gadata, a rabbinic story. There is no scriptural reference, at least overtly here. And so we have to work out why this is a significant story for us. So the rabbis ask at the end of line 3, what were the miracles that were performed for the doors of Nicanor? I mean, I've heard of miracles being performed for people, but miracles being performed for doors? I mean, this is quite remarkable. So Amru, the rabbis explain to line 4. Once upon a time, Nicanor went to bring doors from Alexandria in Egypt. So he made a trip. He took a trip. He went from Jerusalem, presumably, and he went to Alexandria. And he went to get doors there. Why would he go to Alexandria? Presumably, Alexandria was a place where there was fine craftsmanship and he could get some special doors. And evidently, if there were special doors, they needed to be for a special place. So already we're beginning to have, I think, a little bit of deduction here to work out what's going on. Which special place might need special doors if you really want to get the very best doors available? Maybe it's the temple. Maybe the temple needed some new doors. And maybe unlike the first temple period where the doors came from the cedars of Lebanon, so here, Nicanor perhaps was involved with the maintenance of the temple. He was on the temple building committee, etc. And he needed to get new doors. So he thought, I'm going to get the very, very best doors that I can. And the place to get them is Alexandria. Now, why else is Alexandria, at least at this stage in history, particularly famous? I'd suggest the famous shul, which exists in Alexandria. I'm sure you've heard reference to the Talmud in Masechet Sukkah, page 51. It describes the shul as being massive, even bigger than Edgeway United. It's hard to believe that, but even bigger building than Edgeway United, where the shul was so big that people at the back, and this might not have necessarily been due to talking either, the people at the back could not hear when the Chazan or the Baal Koreh were reading or laning. And so therefore the Gabbaim would wave flags at the time that they needed to answer Amen, so that they could hear what was going on. But also what the Talmud says was, the organization socially and welfare terms of the shul was very important. When somebody came into the community and they were new, there were blocks in the shul where people of different professions or trades would sit, and you would be matched with the area which reflected your trade or your profession. So if you were a blacksmith, you would go into the area with the other blacksmiths. It was a way of integrating someone and helping them also be able to have business connections as well. So what that also tells us is Alexandria was presumably a place of great craftsmanship. So if Nicanor was going to Alexandria, he was going there because it was a place which possibly even in his time had a significant Jewish community, but also was a place of great craftsmanship. He was going to get the very, very best doors that he could get, and perhaps these doors would be for the temple. Now, so far so good, but let's see what happens at line 5. B'chazirato, on his way back, Amad alav nafsho shebayam letovo. it appears, for reasons that are not entirely clear, that he traveled back by sea. Maybe the doors were so heavy that was the only way to travel. But one would imagine normally, I think, if you were to be traveling from Alexandria to Eretz Yisrael, I'd imagine that the easiest way to go is along the coastal road. First of all, there's a road there. Secondly, you're right next to water in case you need any. And thirdly, it's the straightest or the shortest route that you can go. Think back to modern history about the importance of coastal roads in Egypt, be it during the Second World War and El Alamein, for instance, or be it during the Six-Day War, when the 55th Reserve Parachute Brigade became famous, of course, for their operation to capture the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and the Kotel. But originally, their first objective in the Six-Day War was the city of El Arish in northeastern Sinai, because that controlled the road along the coast and also had a substantial Egyptian garrison. So the easiest and best way to travel is along that coastal road for many, many reasons. It's safer, you've got water supply, it's the most direct. Control that road. It's in some ways as important in military terms, and it was controlling places like the Gibeon Pass or the Midler Pass in the middle of Sinai, which are the areas that you can get through. Again, familiar to us from the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. So despite that, Nicanor, for whatever reason, decided to go by boat. Now, while he is traveling in the sea, on his way back from Egypt, line 5, Amad alav Nachshol shevayam letovo, and Nachshol in the sea suddenly emerged to try and drown him. Nachshol is a very curious word. When you look at it, if you want to try and understand the lexical terms, it would seem that the closest word to it is the word nachash. Nachash, of course, meaning you're all on mute. So even if you say it, I can't hear you. But if you're saying it, then good. Nachash, of course, is a snake. But if it's a snake, how can there possibly be a snake in the sea to try and sink it? So Rashi explains that actually it's not an animal, but nachshon is another word here for a sa'ara, for a storm. Now, at this point, as should always be the case, whenever we're thinking about any rabbinic story, we've always got to be trying to make connections. The things don't happen by accident, or the references are not made by accident in this story. As in all great literature, all references are significant here, not just happenstance. So we're thinking about someone who's on a boat. He's got a cargo. There's some kind of storm going on. And it seems like the point of the storm, whether it's a storm in the regular sense or whether it's some kind of nachshol, like a snake as a representative of a storm trying to undo him and trying to harm him, he's now on a boat in mortal danger at sea. Of course, this must ring bells with other stories, not Talmudic stories per se, but perhaps most famously will ring a bell with the story of Jonah, the story of Yonah that we read on Yom Kippur as the Haftarah in the afternoon. Of course, Yonah, as we know, is on the boat, and when Yonah tries to hide, and the other sailors throw their various items off the boat, and it still doesn't work, and the storm still continues. And in the end, they come down to Yonah as the one to jump into the sea or to be thrown into the sea. Now, what, by contrast, will be Nicanor's response to this storm in the sea? So the end of line 5. He took one of his doors, and he flung it into the sea. So this is a practical measure. The doors must have been very heavy. Maybe they were weighing down the boat, slowing down the boat. So throw it into the sea. But even though he's thrown it into the sea, poor Nicanor, he's schlepped all the way to Alexandria, presumably for some important reason, maybe even the temple, to get what must have been a pretty expensive door. He's got this door. He's now transporting it back to Israel in the way that he thinks is most appropriate, and he has to throw it into the sea. Oy vey. Terrible. He must have felt awful. And what's worse is, beginning of line 6, the second word, and even so, despite this, the sea did not rest from its anger. So this is a pretty serious matter. Rashi tells us, Rashi confirms for us that this was, he was getting, I've been alluding to this, but we can confirm it now. Rashi confirms for us that he was buying doors, he was getting doors um, for the brass doors, or copper doors rather, for the temple. So those would be much heavier than wooden doors. He's thrown them into the sea, but the sea is still not, stone one is, it's still raging. So middle of line 6, Bikshu lahatil et chaverta. The other sailors wanted to throw the second door into the sea. They thought maybe this will do the trick. Amatu v'karachab, but this time Nicanor stands up, embraces or connects himself, ties himself to the door, and he said to them, "Hitziluni ima, throw me in with it." Gosh, you can imagine the anguish of Nicanor. Throw me in with it. And immediately the sea quiet. Now this is quite remarkable. First of all, that Nicanor could say, "Throw me in with it." I mean, that doesn't really seem to be the most suitable response, at least easy for us to say, sitting here, it come through our chest, but it doesn't seem to be the most suitable response. That's really what someone should say, throw me into the sea before you throw anything else into the sea. But nonetheless, the response is that immediately the storm ends. Very curious. What happens next? At the end of line 7, Nicanor, despite this, is very, very upset because he's lost one of the doors. He was given a mission to bring back 2 doors. He brings back 1. Sounds like me when I'm giving a shopping list. Got to bring back 8 things. I'm lucky I managed to find 5 of them. Okay? Then you have to face the music when you come back. Line 8. When they came to the port in Akko, fascinatingly, the Jerusalem Talmud notes that the port that they came to actually was Jaffa, which is another link, of course, to the story of Jonah, rather than Akko, rather than Acre, further north. Hayatama Mavatspet said, there was a miracle that the door had somehow been pulled along alongside slipstream in some respect, perhaps of the ship, and it came to the dock in Akko. Or alternatively, the Yeshomrim in line 9, a sea animal had swallowed it and had then vomited it out when they came to dry land. Again, another strong link to the story of Jonah. And all these stories, by the way, have to be taken very seriously, even if not necessarily literally in every aspect. They have to be taken seriously because they're teaching us a point. Just like if I was to tell you, it's one of my favorite books, which is The History of London by Edward Rutherford. Some of you may be familiar with it, where he takes a fictitious family over 10 generations living in London to tell the story of London. Not everything that is literal, but everything is to be taken seriously because it's painting a picture that we can understand and relate to of what life was like in London throughout those centuries. So similarly, there's something miraculous definitely is happening. Either that an animal had swallowed it up, or that the sea had carried the door along. But whatever the case, a miracle had occurred for Nicanor. He had not lost his door. And Nicanor is happy, and the door is saved. Now, let's just scroll down as I have to line 11, and 5 words from the end. The story concludes, and we'll analyze this in a minute. Therefore, ultimately, all of the doors in the Beit HaMikdash, after Nicanor's door had been installed, etc., they were all upgraded at a certain point to be gold, except for the gates of Nicanor. Why? Because miracles happened to them. So his doors stayed as these bronze or copper doors. All the other doors were gold. And everybody, whenever they came to the temple, would see these doors and say, "Oh, why are these doors different to all other doors?" Of course, the answer was they would then learn this story and learn about the miracles of Nicanor. Now, let's just analyze this story a little bit. What could have caused Nicanor to behave in this way? So the first point I want to focus on, just we have 5 minutes left, so we'll analyze quickly. The first point I want to focus on is the question of going to Egypt. We know that the Torah does not look favorably on Jews going to Egypt. It would seem, particularly Jews living in Egypt, one can also ask the question about Jews visiting Egypt as well. And if indeed there was an established Jewish community in Alexandria, maybe that's problematic. Maybe Nicanor should not have been going there to get something for the temple. The Torah tells us we should not return, at least on the way that we left, in the way that we left Egypt. We shouldn't return certainly to live in Egypt. And of course, this became, as I'm sure you're aware, a fascinating question for Jews amongst the ages, even from the time of Jeremiah. The end of the book of Jeremiah, of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah has to flee his life down to Egypt, where some Jews had fled from the Babylonians. It's Talmudic times when Jews were in Egypt, and even a kind of alternative temple. So the temple in Jerusalem was built in Egypt, which unfortunately had idolatrous sacrifice in it. But Egypt was a place which Jews couldn't stay away from, even though the Torah prescribes, it seems, on the face of it, Jews living there. Famously, the Rambam lived in Egypt. There is some discussion as to whether he felt that he was living there under duress because of his position as the royal physician, and whether he himself felt that he was sinning by living in Egypt, but this was just force majeure. But also whether once there were Jews in Egypt, was it appropriate then to look after them? But once they're there, you need rabbis to look after them. And various rabbis who lived in Egypt wrote about this over the ages. Most recently, the question was asked to the late Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, of course, the former Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, a tremendous polymath. This was in the late 1970s, when, as the Camp David, obviously Israel-Egypt peace talks, which of course was to become the Camp David agreement, as they progressed, an Israeli journalist was told he was going to be posted to Cairo to be the correspondent for, I can't remember if it was a radio station or a newspaper. And he asked Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, can I live in Egypt? Can I do this, even if I'm going on a temporary basis? And Rabbi Yosef analyzed this from many perspectives, and noted that the Egypt of biblical times is different to the Egypt of today. You're not going to live there. You're not going to live there permanently, and you're working on behalf of the Jewish people, etc. He gave a number of reasons why, in this circumstance, he felt it was permitted, as opposed to someone who specifically said, "I'm moving to Egypt. That's where I should be living." But of course, there's some interesting history even to this, because in the late 1940s, not long before the declaration of the independence of the State of Israel, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef took one of his first senior rabbinic posts. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that it was the Deputy Chief Rabbi of Egypt, where he was for a couple of years, including during 1948, difficult times to be in Egypt. And he had some scary experiences there. And I think in 1949 or 1950, he returned to Israel, became a Dayan in Petach Tikva. So maybe Nicanor was perhaps anguished about having to go to Egypt, and maybe he felt on the way back that there was this was some kind of retribution for him. Difficult to work out exactly what, but maybe Chazal were making the point that even if you have to get things from Egypt, just bear in mind the context and the history from it. Much more recent, or sorry, I shouldn't say more recent, a contemporary of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Eliashiv, Rabbi Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, one of the great sages of Jerusalem, analyzes the question of why Nicanor was prepared to not only throw the doors into the sea, but perhaps even throw himself into the sea. And perhaps, suggests Rabbi Eliashiv, Nicanor was concerned that having gone all the way to Egypt, having got these doors, perhaps there was going to be, heaven forbid, a desecration in God's name if the mission went wrong somehow, if things didn't play out, if the doors had been lost, and therefore he just felt he didn't want to be part of that, and perhaps a little bit like when the Jews committed the sin of the golden calf, and Moses had to plead for them and say in such a moving speech in this parashat Ki Tisa, it makes Henry Fonda and 12 angry men seem like he wasn't doing well. But Moses says, Moshe says, God forgive the people that am I, and if you don't, blot me out from the book which you have written. I don't want to be known if you're not going to save the people. And it's at that point that God says, okay, I'm going to forgive the people. So if a person shows tremendous self-sacrifice at a particular time, maybe that somehow tips the scales if something wrong can happen. So maybe Nicanor was worried that this would have reflected very badly on the Jewish people as a whole. Everybody would know, Jews and non-Jews, that there'd be this special mission to Alexandria. It had all gone wrong, And now look what had happened. And saying, God, please don't let this happen. Just like in the time of Moses. Moses said, Lama yomaru mitzrayim lemor. Why? The Egyptians will say that God couldn't do this. Nicanor is making a similar plea. Don't let people say God can't do this. Miracles happen, and he comes back to Israel. And in the greater context of this part of the Talmud is discussing who is mentioned for praise and who is not mentioned for praise. And having monuments to people for praise, there has to be a good reason for that being the case, as these doors became a monument to Nicanor for praise. So these are two ideas which I think feed into understanding this story. It's a story I think is very easy just to kind of run through and think, oh, it's a bit of a strange story, but why would anyone tell it? But beneath the surface, as I hope we've been able to see, there are some fascinating ideas, fascinating debates, and fascinating dilemmas which we can think about. And I suppose putting ourselves in the shoes of a rabbi standing in a shul 1800 years ago and telling this story, he of course will have a particular message for the people he was listening to. And when we hear it today, we have messages that we can extract from it as well. Be they messages of prayer, be they messages of Kiddush Hashem and sanctifying God's name, or be they messages of thinking always very carefully about the stories in our tradition and the messages which they have in every generation. So thank you all for the opportunity to study and learn with you, and to be on this call. And it's fantastic you've been able to have this Zoom shiur running. I hope, as Stephen said at the beginning, you'll be able to meet in person very soon.